My name is Jerry Vaisey, and this is I Can't Write Right? I got with me Henry Lambert. Can I call you Hank? I guess
Sure.
That's what everybody else calls you. And you wrote a book, Highgate Vermont. And I read most or half of it, and I said, if my hometown, if I changed the names, and I changed the people's names, and I changed back to the same dates, I could sell it as Norwood, New York, and nobody would know the difference. Yeah. So, and then I think, what in the world is Switchell?
Well, Switchell is an old Vermont, or I guess New England drink that the farmers used when they came in from the fields. You go into the milk house where there was a water cooler, and hung from a wire was a glass jug of this concoction called Switchell. And there are variations on the recipe, but basically it's vinegar water with ginger and sometimes a sweetener like maple syrup or brown sugar. And they'd come in from the fields and they'd want something cold to drink, and that was something that slaked their thirst.
And it's not going to cause you to get drunk or anything like that?
No.
It sounds like it would just eat through the...
Yeah, well, Switchell, I use the term Switchell because it's bittersweet, and life is like that. So it's a metaphor for life. You have your good times and your bad, your downs and your ups, and growing up in Highgate, of course, like growing up anywhere, you had the challenges and you had the joys. So,
especially riding a tricycle down
Mill Hill
Road.
Yeah, that was one of my early adventures. 5 years old, I wrote about that adventure, breaking away from the fenced-in yard at the house and going over to Mill Hill, about a block away, and being challenged to ride down, and I crashed into the bank. And
you're lucky you did. I've seen that hill, and you'd had to learn how to swim fast if you'd gone straight down.
Yeah.
Now, what I encourage the people to watch the show to write their own books. So, what caused you to write the book that you wrote in the first place?
Well, growing up in Highgate in a large family, we had opportunities, of course, to talk with my mom and dad about their growing up, but not as much as I would have liked. I'd like to hear more stories, to know them better, to know their background. And I have 3 grown children now, and grandchildren. And I wanted to leave something to them that would kind of explain in a little better fashion how I grew up and some of my ups and downs in the growing up effort. And my first intention was to go to Kinko's and print out maybe 25, 30 copies for them and family. And I was urged to think about putting it into a book. So I searched around and found a publisher that suited me. But writing is, I discovered, was quite an adventure, because when you start writing, those memories come back, and one thing leads to another, and you start putting together a little story.
Do you ever wake up bright and early in the morning with your mind racing through what you've been writing, or what?
Yeah, well, ideas pop up. Things that I'd long forgotten about will come into my mind, and so I learned early on to keep kind of a notebook or a piece of paper by the bed or in my pocket to just jot down ideas and thoughts that I eventually weaved in, and there are a lot of notes, as it turned out, that didn't get into the book. I could have written maybe a book 3 times this size from all the memories. And it was amazing to me to discover that my memories of childhood are quite sharp. I remember a lot of things from my childhood growing up. And as I explained in the early part of the book, I think it's because our minds are a little more receptive at that age than they are now as we get older. I don't know, but Other people say that's not true for them. So I don't know quite why that worked that way. But jotting down ideas, thoughts, memories, and then putting them together in little stories was the method I used.
Now I understand your family got involved a little bit, and other people. So what did they think while you were writing it, where they were not editing it, but reading it over and that? I guess it was towards the end you had.
Toward the end, I had a number of questions that I wanted to verify, and I still didn't get some of the things right, according to some of my siblings. Dates, I did have a couple of dates that were off. Of course, as a memoir writer, you're writing about your experience and how you remember it. And you take an incident or a person that is familiar to all of us. They have their own memory, and they would have written it a little differently. So it's kind of fun to have those conversations. I'm one of 13 children growing up and in a small town, and so we all had different experiences. There's 22 years difference between the oldest and the youngest, so of course the younger generation is going to see things differently than the older ones. I'm I'm fourth oldest, so saw things a little differently.
I was, of course, I tape Highgate's meetings, and I was talking about that I was going to interview you, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, I know him, and we used to do this and we used to do that," and I guess there was quite a herd of turtles there. Used to get together and play.
Yeah, one of the things I write about in the book is that work was very important. You had duties as a youngster in a large family to work, and my dad was a hard worker. A laboring man, and expected us to do the same. And so that came first. But when there was time to break away and join the village kids to play ball or hide and seek, and we'd have kids over in our 2-acre yard playing baseball, trying to avoid the cow plops in the field and that sort of thing. But yeah, it was a lot of good memories about getting together with our friends. And
now, your house, you explained where it was, is down near somewhere near the library, where the library is now?
That's right. It's in the center. It's about a block or so from the library.
On Lambkin Street?
On Lambkin Street. It's the former home of Warren R. Austin, who was a senator for Vermont, and became one of the early ambassadors to the United Nations in the late 1940s.
From little old Highgate.
From little Highgate. And so, in fact, Warren Austin had his initials carved in the sliding door that led to the cow stall that we had. And I always thought, well, he was a boy once, just like I'm a boy there in that very setting. And so that was my connection to the senator.
Yeah, I think from some of the things I see nowadays, more children should grow up like that.
Yeah. And,
the kids, you see them around and they don't know what work is.
Yeah, yeah.
Or work is doing something mechanical. Even farming nowadays, they get on a tractor and this huge field, and you didn't have all that.
Well, we worked on our grandfather's farm, especially during the hay season, and we go up and work in the gardens with them. My parents on my father's side, he was an only child, and so they were alone running this small 100-acre farm in East Highgate. And so they needed help, and we'd go up and help them quite a bit. So we learned a lot about farming. And then my other grandparents, Henri LaRoche, out on the St. Armand Road, he had sons and daughters that helped on the farm. But I started working away from home at the summer of my 11th birthday. That was my first job for pay. and you were expected, if you weren't strictly needed at home to work, or if you had the opportunity, take a job. So I took a job for $5 a week, driving tractor and driving the horses during the hay season.
But $5 a week back then was not what it is now. It was
No.
actual money.
Yeah, it was good money for an 11-year-old kid.
Oh, now, I noticed that you go, when you're talking about one set of parents, the real Quebecois, and the others, now were they English or they just didn't speak French?
My mother grew up in a French-Canadian family. Her parents, in fact, my grandparents, moved from Canada in the early 20th century and got the farm there. So she and they spoke French. In fact, my grandparents spoke no English. On my father's side, French was spoken, but it was not the primary language.
And they were a French family as well?
They had English and French roots.
That's quite common up around here.
Yeah. But growing up, I spoke, we as children spoke French with our grandparents, but it was a limited vocabulary after all. It was, we were 5 to 12, 15 years old, and I still retain some of that ability, but I don't feel comfortable speaking the language.
Oh yeah, you probably can understand more than you can speak.
I have a pretty good ear for it, yeah. So
that must have been something. I know a lot of people around here, a mixed relationship, either French and something else, or French and French, or something like that. And it's good for you to be in both cultures.
yeah.
I don't know if you were in a culture where if somebody came to visit, the frying pan came off the wall and they had to eat or else.
Yeah. One of the things in our house, and it was typical, I think, of most rural families, was the door was always open for visitors. You would feel free to go knock on the door to have a conversation or to tell a story, to see how the kids are. Our mother especially was very welcoming, and I wrote a little vignette here about the open door, that she always was so welcoming with fresh donuts or soup or a sandwich to invite somebody in and have a conversation. So.
Then you had a boarder at the house, if I read it right. And is that typical of the day?
Well, our dad was an overseer of the poor, which was the system in most Vermont towns where that was the precursor to the welfare system. So, as the overseer of the poor, an elected position, he would go out and visit people who were down and out, and occasionally there was a person, an elderly person, who may have been a burden on the family, or he was just down and out and could not sustain himself. Dad would bring him to the poor farm in Sheldon, which was a place where people could find work and 3 meals a day and a bed to sleep in. But often before bringing that person to the poor farm, he'd bring him home for a meal and at the house and a night stay, because it was kind of too late to bring him to the poor farm, or it didn't fit Dad's schedule. So yeah, we did that on a number of occasions. And in later years, our grandmothers, after the grandfathers had died, our grandmothers at different times boarded at the house. So those were great memories, because we could speak with people we didn't know and learn about dire situations and how life was elsewhere. So,
Great.
Yeah.
Now, how did you get to pick this particular printer, this particular publisher?
Well, I looked around at publishing. This is called Lulu. LULU is the publishing company. It's considered a self-publishing outfit. I looked at Amazon, and they were a little less expensive to publish, but the return was not half as good, and they didn't do any work for you.
Oh.
You had to do your own, get your own ISBN from the identification number that libraries use, and a lot of other things that Lulu just went to work, and they worked it out nicely, and they have a system where you send in your manuscript, and they give you two opportunities to correct it after they have set it up. So they do all the setup and the font size and all that sort of thing. Whereas Amazon, you'd have to do all that yourself.
Yeah, it's not worth it.
Yeah, so this was a little more expensive, but it saved me an awful lot of work.
Now, I know you do book signings here, there, and the other place.
Yeah,
what's that like?
Well, that's my first experience with book signing. The first one was at the Highgate Library. I did one at the Swanton Library, and I did one a few days ago at the South Burlington Library. And I've seen one only once, so I kind of took my cues from that, where you open it up with a kind of an explanation of why you wrote, and then you start talking about an experience, and you read a little bit from the book about that experience. And I did it chronologically, as I did in the book, followed that sequence of childhood, boyhood, teen years, young adulthood, college, army, and so on. And this goes only to the age of 30. Mm-hmm. My wife and we married in 1972, and I was 29 then, and so I thought that was a good break point, because that would be my young life. And my next book is going to be from marriage to the present.
So you aren't intimidated by writing now that you got one out of the way.
Yeah, yeah.
I know you, and I've heard it from other authors. The first one you're kind of, and then after that you've dove into the cold water, and
yeah,
you didn't drown, so you're.
It's a funny feeling once the manuscript goes off to the publisher. That's it, you know. And I learned from other authors that one of the things that happens while you're writing, and you're nearing that point where you've got to cut it off. You start getting the heebie-jeebies, because you're not sure that each of these segments is as you like it. So you go back and you revise, and you go back, and I found myself going back and back, and finally my daughter-in-law, Teresa Schwegel, who is an accomplished writer herself, lives in Chicago, said, every author comes to that, you just have to stop it. You just have to cut it off and say, this is it. And I've learned that many authors feel that way, that it's never quite complete in their own mind. So, and I did find some typos after all, and that's something I learned, that the next time I will have somebody, a professional proofreader, actually proofread for commas and
that sort of
misspellings and typos. And
now, did Molly get to read it before you published it?
she did. She had a good. My wife Molly had a good once over to suggest with some suggestions. Teresa, as I mentioned, was a great support. I have a niece, Megan Lambert, who is an accomplished writer and a professor of literature and other things. gave me some great help in structuring the book and offering suggestions that you might try this, you might try that. That was early on, but very, very helpful.
Yeah, I noticed it was quite well structured. You could just follow it. I mean,
Yeah.
and relate to, if you're from this sort of a community, relate to your own, which was, I found enjoyable.
Oh, good.
Like you say, the team of horses, and then I guess what, your father fell off the...
My grandfather, Lambert, fell off the hay wagon. I was 10 or 11, and I was holding the horses, but you got to hold them back,
Yeah.
otherwise they go too fast for the hay loader to bring the hay onto the wagon. And I wasn't strong enough, apparently, because they were going a little too fast, and he had me stop the horses a number of times, and but one time was too many. The load was almost finished, and he slipped off the wagon, fell down, fell off, hit the ground, breaking his neck and severely injuring his wrist.
Oh.
And that ended his farming.
Well, that hay wagon is, it's like standing on jello sometimes until it packs down.
Yeah, packing loose hay is quite an art, actually.
Yeah.
You have to know what you're doing.
Yeah, 'cause when you get it pretty high, the whole thing can fall off.
Yeah.
I've seen that with tractors.
Yeah.
With nobody on the hay wagon, and you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, well, oats are the worst. Oats are slippery.
Oh.
The slippery stalks, and farmers usually didn't load a full load of oats because they'd slip off before they'd get to the barn. So they'd typically mount the load about half and then draw that to the barn. But,
yeah, that's kind of a ride down to a full hay wagon's kind of a ride down to the ground. And if your feet aren't under you, if you didn't feel it going soon enough,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're going to be doing this again.
Well, you mean writing again?
Yeah, writing again.
Yeah, I've started to with some notes and an outline. I wanted to start writing. It's interesting how, as I mentioned, my memories of childhood are quite sharp, but my adulthood not so much. I don't know why that is.
I think that's kind of normal.
but-
I can still remember the smell of Mrs. Allen's bread.
Yeah.
And we were downwind from it, and that guy was about 3 or 4 or something like that. And, he just drew you in.
Yeah.
But things now, especially now at this age, what happened yesterday, I don't know what did happen yesterday.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So,
Well, there are themes. I've got some themes about, of course, raising our children and talking about our children, and our deaths in the family, my parents' deaths as they were growing up, and the moves that we made from Washington, D.C. to Vermont, and the jobs I had. So that it'll all come together, but it'll be a little different style, I think.
yeah. And now we got about 4 minutes left. What would you say to somebody that is just a little reluctant and thinking about writing a book? What would you say to encourage them?
Well, I would say just write. And once that discipline starts, writing something every day, doesn't have to be good English, just thoughts or ideas or feelings, especially how you felt during certain occasions.
Would you do that by hand, or would you wait and type?
Well, it depends what people are comfortable with. I started doing it by hand, but I would say to people, whatever's comfortable for you, jot things down, jot your ideas, your memories, or you could start writing fiction, a fictional story based on some of your experience. It doesn't have to be the authentic thing. Just let everything roll, let it roll. One of the things I struggle with as a writer, and I was warned about this by an instructor I had, is as you're writing for a story, there's a tendency to be critical inside your head about what you're putting on paper, and you're mentally editing as you're writing. So she suggested, just write. Don't be critical of how it goes down on paper or the computer. You can always go back and then refine it. But the idea is to let your thoughts flow and get into that frame of mind where you're just feeling and you're thinking and you're jotting words down. And it doesn't have to be proper. It doesn't even have to be spell right. But just get into that process and then go back and polish it up.
Lastly, because we're running out of time, I keep talking about if you have a event that was unsettling, especially if you've been in a war or something like that, that just write it down and don't expect anybody to read it so it gets it out of your mind. What do you think about that?
Well, writing can be very therapeutic for sure. Putting things down that your feelings. If you have one of the things I've done when I was going through a difficult time was exactly that, to jot things down and write a letter to somebody. Let's say you're in a confrontation with somebody, just write a letter to that person and then let that person speak to you and jot that down, imagining what that person would say to you.
Oh.
And so it's a back and forth conversation. And then you can do with that what you've written down with what you will. You could burn it, you could save it for reflecting on it later on, but it's very therapeutic to do that sort of thing, yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time. And it's been a very big thrill for me. I know I've seen you a lot in Swanton, and you are very public oriented, and I really enjoyed this. And I hope that you come back when you write your next book. It might not be tomorrow. These things take time, but and I really enjoyed reading this. So.
Well, I'm glad. Thank you very much for having me on and for talking about my book.
Well, thank you for coming, and so we better wrap this up. Now, anybody out there that is in the least bit thinking about writing, I would suggest you start reading some of the local authors. If you've seen my show, you've seen me talk to several. And like Hank says, don't think about you're going to publish it right away. Just write it down for your own use, and if it's in the middle of the night, just jot it down on something. Have a notebook or something next to your bed, or 3x5 cards. Just jot it down, and then later on, if you decide, oh yeah, this would make a good story, go ahead and do it. But best thing is to get it out of your head and on paper. So, well, thank you very much for watching our show. And as you see, I don't have an author all the time, but I have some pretty good ones, and this is one of the ones I enjoyed the most. So thank you very much, Hank, and then I guess this will be a wrap, and I'll see you around.